The Silk Road, often evoked by images of caravans shimmering across deserts or ships docking in faraway ports, has been celebrated as one of the great arteries of world commerce. But its untold stories stretch far beyond mere trade and wealth, for it was not only a marketplace but a theater of humanity's dreams, fears, inventions, and cultural experiments. And if we follow its winding paths from the imperial palaces of Chang'an to the bazaars of Samarkand, from the fire temples of Persia to the monasteries of Dunhuang, we discover that the Silk Road was not merely a highway of silk and spices, but a living bridge of civilizations, a network of encounters that transformed the identities of all who touched it. Long before Ferdinand von Richthofen coined the phrase Silk Road in the 19th century, the roads themselves had been alive for centuries, perhaps millennia, with obsidian from Anatolia, jade from Khotan, and lapis lazuli from Badakhshan, making their way into Mesopotamian temples, showing that even in the Bronze Age, human communities craved connection with distant lands. But by the time of the Han Dynasty, when Chinese silk began to move in quantities toward the west, the network of caravan routes and mountain passes had crystallized into a recognizable world system of exchange. Yet silk was only one thread in a tapestry far richer. Along with bolts of fabric and bags of spice came tales whispered in caravanserais, scriptures copied in monasteries, medical formulas, mathematical symbols, songs, recipes, and even diseases, so that the real cargo of the Silk Road was not simply material, but intellectual and spiritual, not only wealth, but wisdom, not only goods, but germs. And through these exchanges, the world of antiquity was transformed. Consider religion, perhaps the most powerful current to flow through the Silk Road's veins. When the Buddha first taught in India, his words might have remained confined to the Ganges plain had not monks and pilgrims ventured northward through the passes of the Hindu Kush, bearing sutras and relics into the oases of Central Asia, in Khotan, Kashgar, Turfan, and Dunhuang. Buddhist monasteries grew into vibrant hubs of learning, supported by merchant donations from traders who sought merit to protect their perilous journeys. Within their stone walls and painted caves, translators labored by candlelight, rendering Sanskrit scriptures into Chinese, blending Indian metaphysics with Chinese traditions of Taoism and Confucianism, giving birth to wholly new schools of thought like Chan, which would eventually blossom as Zen in Japan. In those monasteries, art flourished too. Murals of bodhisattvas adorned the walls, their features subtly mixed, sometimes with Indian lotus eyes, sometimes with Central Asian noses, sometimes with Chinese robes, a visual testimony to the cosmopolitan world that Buddhism had created along the road. And Buddhism was not alone. Nestorian Christians, declared heretics in Byzantium, journeyed east, carrying their gospels across Persia and into China, where Tang dynasty inscriptions record the presence of thriving communities, and even the emperor permitted them temples. Zoroastrian priests carried fire rituals into Central Asia. Manichaean preachers spread their dualist cosmology, and later, with the rise of Islam, caravans carried not only goods, but also the call to prayer. Sufi mystics founding lodges in towns, like Bukhara and Samarkand, creating spiritual sanctuaries parallel to commercial stations. In every town where caravans paused, faiths collided, intermarried, borrowed, and debated, turning the Silk Road into the greatest classroom of comparative religion in history. Alongside religion flowed science and philosophy, for the roads were not only arteries of belief, but of knowledge. When Alexander's armies had marched east, they left behind fragments of Hellenistic thought in Bactria and beyond, and in the centuries that followed, Greek geometry, astronomy, and medicine mingled with Persian traditions and Indian discoveries. By the medieval period, Samarkand and Baghdad had become centers where the wisdom of many cultures was synthesized. Indian numerals, carried by scholars and traders, traveled westward through these routes, eventually giving rise to the Hindu-Arabic numeral system that revolutionized mathematics in Europe. The concept of zero, alien to Greek thought, journeyed across these lands, reshaping how humans could conceive of the infinite. Paper, invented in China, first reached Samarkand after a battle in the 8th century, when Chinese papermakers were captured by the Abbasids, and from there, the technique spread westward to Baghdad, then to Cairo, Cordoba, and eventually to Europe, igniting a revolution in literacy and learning. Gunpowder, too, first devised by Chinese alchemists, traveled along these roads, reaching the Middle East, where scholars refined its formulas, and Europe, where it changed the face of war forever. The astrolabe, perfected in the Islamic world, allowed travelers and sailors to navigate with greater accuracy, while Chinese compasses began to appear further west. At every stage, what mattered was not simply the invention itself, but the way it was carried, altered, and reimagined along the way, so that the Silk Road functioned as the great laboratory of human ingenuity. But to speak only of scholars and monks would be to miss the texture of daily life on the road, for the Silk Road was above all a theater of human encounter. Caravanserais, those fortified inns that dotted the routes, became crossroads where Persians, Arabs, Turks, Chinese, Indians, Armenians, and even Venetians might share a meal around the same fire. Within their thick walls, safe from bandits, languages mixed, forming hybrid dialects, and in those nights of laughter and suspicion, songs were exchanged, jokes translated, and friendships forged. Merchants, though driven by profit, became cultural ambassadors, carrying not only goods, but customs, recipes, and stories. At the same time, the Silk Road was alive with spies. 4 empires needed intelligence on one another, and traders were perfect carriers of news. Han Dynasty envoys like Zhang Qian were sent far beyond China's frontiers to discover the lands of the West, returning with reports that reshaped imperial strategy. Later, travelers like Marco Polo or faithful witnesses brought back to Europe visions of Mongol courts and Chinese cities that inspired an age of exploration. Information itself was as valuable as silk or spices, and the border between espionage and storytelling was always thin. For rumors often served the purposes of diplomacy and war, yet perhaps the most sobering untold story of the Silk Road was its role in carrying disease. Long before modern epidemiology, the roads had already connected biological worlds. Smallpox and measles traveled these routes into new populations. Most devastating of all was the bubonic plague, which in the 14th century moved from the grasslands of Central Asia along caravan lines to the ports of the Black Sea, and from there by ship into Europe, where it killed perhaps a third of the continent's population. The Black Death was a Silk Road traveler, its fleas riding unnoticed among furs and grains, and its legacy reshaped European society. Thus, while the road gave life through knowledge and connection, it also took life away through pandemics, reminding us of the double-edged nature of globalization, even in ancient times. But beneath the grand sweep of religion, science, and disease were the countless invisible lives of ordinary people whose footprints have faded into the sand. Pilgrims with little more than faith in their satchels trudged across deserts in search of holy sites. Refugees fleeing war found new homes in distant towns. Slaves, dragged unwillingly, carried their songs and traditions into foreign lands, subtly shaping local cultures. Artists traveled, painting for patrons in towns far from their birthplace, leaving behind mosaics, textiles, and sculptures that fused multiple traditions into something new. Women, often overlooked in official records, played crucial roles as cultural intermediaries, marrying into different communities, raising children of mixed heritage, cooking foods that combined flavors from several worlds. The result was a human laboratory of hybrid identities, a world where categories blurred, and where people became living embodiments of the Silk Road itself. Even the arts and food tell stories of these encounters. Chinese ceramics absorbed Persian designs of arabesques and winged creatures. Central Asian music carried Indian rhythms and Persian melodies into China, influencing court orchestras. Recipes traveled invisibly. Dumplings traced their heritage through Central Asia. Noodles became spaghetti when carried west. Spices like cinnamon and pepper moved into kitchens from one end of Eurasia to the other, reshaping taste buds forever. In the vibrant markets of Samarkand, one could find pomegranates, saffron, silk, rugs, and paper. But also here, a cacophony of languages: Persian poets reciting verses, Turkish bards singing epics, Chinese storytellers weaving tales, Armenian merchants haggling, Arab scholars debating law. Every sound was a note in the symphony of the Silk Road at its heart. The Silk Road was about connection of minds, souls, and senses. It was a world where a Sogdian merchant might build a Buddhist shrine while praying in a Zoroastrian temple, where a Chinese general wore Persian armor, where a Nestorian monk debated with a Muslim scholar, where a caravan cook might serve flatbread stuffed with spices from 3 different continents. The road was never a single line, but a web, a network of arteries branching, diverging, and converging, and its importance lay not in the wealth it produced, but in the world it created. Even when maritime routes began to eclipse it during the Age of Discovery, its legacy lingered in the hybrid religions of Central Asia, the domes of Samarkand, the words borrowed into languages, the recipes simmering with foreign flavors, and even in the very idea of globalization that shapes our modern era. To walk the Silk Road is to walk through humanity's oldest dream, the dream of connection beyond borders, beyond suspicion, beyond difference. If one were to pause at the bustling caravanserai of Samarkand during the height of its prosperity under the Timurid dynasty, one would immediately grasp that the Silk Road was far more than a corridor of fabrics and spices, for here, the world converged in a whirl of colors, voices, and ideas. Merchants from China spreading bolts of silk beside Persian rug makers, Arab scholars unrolling manuscripts on astronomy, Indian traders displaying pepper and cardamom, and Turkic horsemen boasting of their steeds, all beneath the same domes where musicians plucked lutes that carried echoes of distant lands, where cooks stirred stews, seasoned with saffron and cinnamon, and where poets recited verses that fused metaphors from multiple cultures. And this mingling was not an exception but the norm along the road, which was less a highway and more a human ecosystem where languages, beliefs, and customs constantly cross-pollinate. The Sogdians, a merchant people from Central Asia, became the quintessential intermediaries, their caravans stretching from Chang'an to Byzantium, their letters and graffiti surviving on cave walls and scraps of paper, testifying to their resilience, pragmatism, and cosmopolitan nature, for they could pray at a Zoroastrian fire altar, support a Buddhist monastery, and send their children to study with Nestorian priests, embracing every culture that could aid their survival. Their role illustrates a truth often hidden, that the Silk Road's strength lay not in the empires that claimed to control it, but in the ordinary peoples who lived by it. Those who bridged gaps between civilizations by necessity, invention, and sheer human adaptability. The spread of art along the Silk Road reveals even more of these untold layers. In the caves of Dunhuang, nestled against the sands of the Gobi Desert, murals depict not only Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but also Persian musicians, Indian dancers, and Central Asian donors, painted with techniques that betray Greco-Roman influence, absorbed through centuries of contact. Silk Road art was never purely Chinese, purely Persian, or purely Indian. It was always hybrid, always a negotiation between traditions, resulting in mosaics of cultural identities. The colossal Buddhas of Bamiyan, carved into Afghan cliffs, stood as guardians of this cosmopolitan vision, their features bearing traces of Hellenistic naturalism mingled with Indian spirituality and Central Asian craftsmanship, embodying the road's essence, a synthesis of many worlds. Even after their tragic destruction in the modern era, They remain symbols of what the Silk Road represented, a crossroads, where civilizations did not merely meet, but embraced and transformed one another. Coins, to tell this tale. Greek-style coins found in Bactria, with inscriptions in local languages. Chinese copper mingling with Persian silver, revealing economies that had become entangled long before the idea of globalization entered our vocabulary. Yet the Silk Road was also a world of politics and power, a stage for empires to project influence far beyond their borders. The Tang dynasty, recognizing the road's importance, extended its garrisons deep into Central Asia, maintaining protectorates over oasis towns to safeguard both trade and diplomacy. Similarly, the Persian Empire's Parthians, then Sasanians, understood that control over caravan routes meant not only revenue, but also prestige, and thus they guarded passes and taxed goods while promoting their own culture along the road. The Byzantine Empire, though often hostile to Persia, relied heavily on Silk Road connections for luxury goods, particularly silk itself, which was so highly prized that Byzantine envoys smuggled silkworms out of China in hollow bamboo sticks, breaking China's long monopoly and forever changing Mediterranean economies. These acts of espionage revealed the road's strategic dimension, not simply about commerce, but about imperial survival. For control of the Silk Road meant access to the tools of power horses, weapons, knowledge, and prestige goods that underpinned royal authority. When the Mongols swept across Eurasia in the 13th century, they created the largest contiguous empire the world had ever known, and in doing so, they reanimated the Silk Road, making it safer than ever before. Under the Pax Mongolica, caravans traveled from one end of Eurasia to the other with relative security, and the Mongol Khans actively encouraged the movement of artisans, scholars, and merchants. This era was perhaps the Silk Road's golden age of exchange, for it saw the greatest mingling of cultures, technologies, and ideas in recorded history before the modern age. Yet even in this time of connection, the road remained double-edged, for it was the Mongol openness that also allowed the plague to travel westward with deadly efficiency. Music and performance along the Silk Road were as important as goods and faiths, though often forgotten. Central Asian musicians became prized entertainers in Tang China, where their lutes, flutes, and dances filled the imperial court with exotic rhythms. Instruments themselves migrated. The Persian barbat became the Chinese pipa, eventually transforming into the Japanese biwa, showing how even sound traveled and evolved along these routes. Songs told stories of distant lands, and through performance, even illiterate travelers could taste the cultures of others. Oral epics, like those of Turkic bards or Persian storytellers, moved across the steppes, carrying not only entertainment, but moral codes and historical memory. Music was perhaps the most democratic of Silk Road exchanges, for it crossed language barriers instantly, uniting listeners in shared emotion. In caravanserais, a musician could earn a meal by playing, and thus, music became a portable passport across cultures, a way for the poorest traveler to find welcome among strangers. Food, too, reveals the Silk Road's intimacy. The diffusion of ingredients and cooking methods created culinary traditions that remain with us. Noodles, often claimed as a Chinese invention, spread westward, mingling with Mediterranean pasta traditions. Dumplings appeared in endless variations, from Chinese jawazi to Central Asian manti to Eastern European pierogi, each retaining a trace of the road that carried them. Spices like cinnamon, saffron, and pepper transformed cuisines in lands where they had never grown, shaping tastes and even economies. Tea, cultivated in China, traveled westward, eventually becoming a staple in Central Asia and Russia, while coffee, originating in Ethiopia, traveled east, blending with tea cultures. Sugar, carried from India, found its way into Persian sweets, and then into European confections. Each bite, each sip, was a memory of a journey, the echo of a caravan. The fact that modern kitchens combine these flavors without thought is itself the ultimate legacy of the Silk Road, globalization embodied in a meal. Yet, for all its richness, the Silk Road was never a utopia of harmony. Banditry, political unrest, and natural hazards made every journey perilous. The deserts of the Taklamakan and the Gobi swallowed caravans whole, their bones preserved beneath shifting sands, reminders of the risks faced by those who dared. Mountains, like the Pamirs and the Tian Shan, tested human endurance, their icy passes claiming lives each winter. Political fragmentation often made travel dangerous. A merchant could be welcomed in one kingdom but robbed in the next. Documents from the Silk Road's archives reveal endless petitions to rulers for protection, testimony to the dangers lurking beyond each bend. The road was as much about survival as it was about exchange, and the resilience of those who persisted is perhaps its most human story. The environmental history of the Silk Road adds another dimension, often forgotten. The road carved its path not only through political boundaries, but also through fragile ecosystems. Oasis towns like Turfan and Khotan depended on ingenious irrigation systems, qanats and karez that drew water from underground channels to sustain life in arid deserts. These engineering feats themselves traveled along the road, spreading from Persia into Central Asia and China. Pastoral nomads, herding sheep, goats, and camels, played as great a role as settled townsfolk, for it was they who guided caravans across steppes and deserts, who bred the hardy horses that empires coveted, who served as both protectors and predators of the road. Climate fluctuations, such as the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, directly impacted Silk Road trade, causing famines, shifting routes, and altering the fortunes of empires. Thus, the Silk Road was never only a human creation, but also a negotiation with nature, a story of adaptation to harsh environments and fragile resources. Language, too, became a Silk Road creation. The mixing of tongues produced lingua francas that facilitated trade, Sogdian in Central Asia, Persian in the Islamic world, later Turkic dialects that spread with migrating peoples. Words themselves testify to these journeys. The English word sugar traces back through Arabic sukar, Persian shakar, and Sanskrit shakara. The word orange travels from Sanskrit naranga, through Persian and Arabic, into European languages. Even modern words in everyday use bear within them the fingerprints of caravan routes and merchants' tongues. Languages evolved not in isolation, but in constant dialogue, and the Silk Road was their classroom. The story of women on the Silk Road remains one of the least told, yet their role was central. In many caravan towns, intermarriage created new hybrid communities. Women ran shops, brewed beer, wove textiles, and managed households that served as hubs of hospitality for travelers. Noble women sometimes acted as patrons of art and religion, funding monasteries, temples, or mosques along the road. Others became diplomats, married across cultures to secure alliances. Some were healers, carrying herbal knowledge across borders. The exchange of textile patterns often depended on women's artistry, and thus entire industries of design and weaving owe their fusion to their hands. Their contributions remain hidden in official chronicles, but shine through in the textiles preserved in desert tombs and the oral traditions that survive among descendants. The Silk Road, in its essence, was always about movement of people, ideas, goods, and identities, and, in this ceaseless circulation, lay its power. Each encounter, however brief, added to the vast mosaic of human culture. A Jewish merchant in Kaifeng might consult a Muslim astronomer, a Mongol Khan might employ a Venetian artisan, a Chinese monk might pray in an Indian style to a deity depicted with Greek artistic realism. Each of these moments was a seed, planted in foreign soil, growing into something new. The road was never static. It was alive, evolving, changing with each generation. And this dynamism is what made it the greatest untold story of human history.